Of course there's more. Are you kidding me? Hello everybody, long time no see, welcome back to the channel. As I said in the last video, this is going to be a multi-video update because I have an entire year worth of content to share with you. I used to do these videos every week on a Saturday, but due to my recording setup, the fact that I record all my content in MKV format in OBS rather than MP4, it is a major pain in the ass to edit. Magic's Vegas 18 takes a dump anytime the video length gets more than 3 or 4 MKV videos in size, and of course, DaVinci Resolve, as great as it is, refuses to render it. What a great thing to find out after you've spent hours editing a video. So all of these problems ended up making editing these a huge hassle, but I'm experimenting with dual recording setup where I record both in MKV for security in case something crashes, the video doesn't get corrupted, and MP4, which is hopefully going to work out well and I can actually edit these every Saturday again. Anyways, in the last video we looked at the prototype called Atomicon, which is a post-apocalyptic survival game, but that is not the only new project I've started in the past year. So without further ado, why don't we take a look at the next prototype called Angler. Angler was a game idea that was born when I remembered, I haven't participated in a game jam in a while. And even though there were some interesting game jams already out there, I figured, you know what, let me host one myself. And being a huge sucker for narrative single-player games, I created the Narrative Imperative Game Jam. This was the first time I've ever hosted an event like this, and to be honest, the whole reason it exists is because I wanted to slack off and make a little game jam. Basically, I created the whole damn thing so I could participate in it myself. I did, of course, exclude myself from the final pool. You know, it'd be kind of weird if you try to win your own competition. What if you win? What if you lose? And I did actually commit to a small cash prize. It was $100 for the first place, $50 for second, and $30 for third. So it's not much, but at least it's something to participate for. Plus, I figured it would be a great experience organizing one of these events for future reference. So the game jam was set out to be just a little 2 weeks long, and I missed the deadline. Why? Because I made the project way too big for 2.5 weeks. So anyways, as per the usual, here I am turning this project into a fully fledged game that we're gonna end up putting up on Steam. And that part is a promise, because this happens to be the second project that involves more than just myself. The gentleman who was helping me out with 3D modeling for the Atomicon project is coming in on board as modeler number 1. The space of modeler number 2 is occupied by an ambitious game developer, 3D modeler, and a long-time channel viewer, Anthony, also known as Hyas. Sorry, Hyas, ended up doxing your first name there, buddy. And last but not least, team member number 3, a sound engineer by the name of Noah. I was initially planning on doing the sound effects and recording and audio mixing for the entire game by myself, and you will not believe how happy I am that I actually came across Noah. This guy is a sound engineering genius. The quality of his work is unparalleled. He always goes above and beyond on every single sound file, and I'm just honestly excited for you to hear what the game sounds like with his work in place. Anyways, why don't we dive right into what you're seeing in front of you is a piece of concept art that I had created to try and communicate the general gist of the idea to the 3D modelers and the sound guy, the whole team, as that is the purpose of concept art, to make sure that what you have in your head is clearly communicated to all members of the team and everybody is on the same page. And of course, at this point, if you are following this, major spoilers of the main story. So if you're a developer looking to learn, keep on watching, and if you're a viewer just kind of observing, you've been warned. So this story is a space tale. A tale about an Imperial Army sergeant and a prisoner being transported back to the Imperial Army for evading drafting. While awaiting pickup from the Imperial cruisers, they become stranded in an alien spaceship that was suspended in the middle of nowhere, cloaked under invisibility. A huge source of inspiration for this game was my recent completion of a game called Outer Wilds. Coasting on a fresh wave of inspiration and jonesing to participate in the game jam is pretty much the primary reason why I took on this project. God damn it, I needed an excuse, and if I can't find one, I'll make one, hence why the game jam happened. In any case, I am borrowing a lot of things that have deeply impressed me about that game, but also I'm a stickler for horror and science fiction, so a lot of that is going to be coming into the mix as well. So for this piece of concept art, I thought it would be a good idea to put something together that in one image communicates what it is that I'm trying to build. And I think the final result ended up communicating that pretty well. It's a very simple piece, a hole in the wall of an alien ship and a couple of humans in a clearly oversized environment. After that, the first thing I got to working on is the design of the alien. I had a general idea for something humanoid but elongated. It was alien enough for it to appear foreign, but the bipedal structure allowed me to still easily animate it as a human being would. I've never animated aliens, so it's probably not a good idea to go for an alien design for what was, at the time, a 2-week-long project. This alien race originates as a race of monks, which means I also had to quickly come up with some sort of religious attire, and I think the final design we went with had communicated the idea well enough. Since my next step was to do some basic blocking out for the level, I figured instead of working with a grid or a boring gray mesh, instead I put together a couple of quick pattern designs for something that would be located on an alien ship seemingly made out of stone. We then set up some basic level geometry for what will be the alien spaceship, set up some basic lighting, generate some additional texture maps for our painted stone texture using a handy little program called Mintex. And of course, last but not least, we set up the player controller. We then spent some time playing around with some architectural quirks for something that's going to end up being a pillar. We play around with setting up a player flashlight. And then I got an idea to introduce a bit of a limit when it comes to the amount of light the player has access to. Now, something I've learned in the past with my very early game called Way Home is that it's usually really annoying to just give the player one single flashlight and then just make the entire game pitch black. That tends to be very annoying. So what I figured I'm gonna do is give the player plenty of light with the use of these drones. The player would be allowed to carry up to 3 of these drones whose onboard projector light is capable of illuminating very big areas, whereas the onboard flashlight is only good enough for the immediate environment. This way the player has the ability to light up the entire surrounding by using these drones. Not only that, the drones actually offer an additional mechanic. Borrowing from Half-Life, the drones are equipped with a very strong magnetic tool that allows us to grab, push, and pull very heavy objects that the player themselves would never be able to move. This imposes some limits in the level that the player has to overcome by using the drones as a puzzle mechanic. The only problem is these drones will be destructible, which means that at some point the player has to return to the starting area and pick up a bunch of more drones, which is seemingly a counterintuitive way of handling it. We really don't want the player trailing back and forth just because they ran out of drones, and because I'm planning on implementing some very crucial acts where the drone absolutely has to be used to resolve some sort of an emergency. It would really not be good if the player soft locks themselves out of it because they ran out of them. So what I'm planning to do is to have the little scout ship that the player arrives on to have a little fabricator and allow the player to recall a new drone from any location in the alien spaceship. Of course, recalling a new drone means that the old one will be destroyed, so there's always only a limit of 3 drones at any point in time. We set up a couple of pews to create social gathering environments. These came in the round and straight flavor. And then just to see what it looks like, we've set up this little circle of benches where the player's gonna end up finding some notes, some tablets to read and get some background lore. Since the different sections of the ship were going to be connected somehow, we ended up creating this design of a weird looking door. By that point, it's been decided that the area that the player arrives at first is actually going to be a temple, so that meant I had to design a number of religious objects. Among them was a small fountain around which we can actually arrange our curved benches. And then I decided to go for something larger, more of a statue, a monument to some sort of a significant historical event in this alien's history. At this point, I haven't come up with what the story is about, but I had a sense of direction of where I wanted to go and what sort of theme I might want to explore. Potentially, this monument could suggest some sort of a backstory for the alien race, and I thought it might be a neat way to introduce some environmental storytelling too. The next course of action was to completely rewrite the player movement scheme. I usually borrow the default FPS controller code from the Godot engine's documentation page as a starter, but this time around, because we are dealing with movement in a low-gravity environment, inertia and jetpack mechanics, that starter code wasn't really working out. It was simply far too stiff, and there was no space for very fine adjustments for inertia. So we ended up employing a little bit of vector shenanigans and experimentation to get that fluid, spacey movement feel. It was right about this point when I started receiving submissions from one of the modelers, so I went ahead and created the next set of concept art pieces for some debris, which we're going to end up scattering all over the levels. They have previously created a batch of debris pieces that I could already use in the level, but they weren't quite fitting the entire level aesthetic. And this was again a very important lesson and reminder of why it is important to create concept artwork. You want to make sure that everyone's on the same page. Next thing on my list was to create the user interface that would tell the player how much fuel, oxygen, boost, and health they have. I had an idea for this rotary interface that was essentially a number of tubes that fill up with this liquid indicating your level of appropriate resource, and the best way I knew how to do that would be in Blender to create a three-dimensional model and use the Bezier curve start and end values, animating them, and then rendering out a series of still frames. Provided I render out the frames in a low enough resolution, this shouldn't take up too many resources on a texture page, considering that for boost and health I am mainly working with values between 0 and 100, which means I only needed 100 frames for each resource indicator. Having rendered out the entire interface and placing and reassembling it in the canvas layer node of the player, I believe I was pretty satisfied with the result, even though it seems a little strange to see fully three-dimensional rendered out user interface on a 2D plane. I eventually got used to it, but who knows, maybe we can revisit the user interface with a more two-dimensional approach. I wanted to switch gears for a little while and just relax, do some 3D modeling, which is how I came up with an idea of this interesting looking wall-mounted light source. It was around this time when I started questioning what is the logistical history of this alien. What is the main driving force of their technology, being a monk race? What are the primary materials they built their technology out of? Answering these questions would be a great opportunity to enrich the backstory of the world. While exploring the alien ship, the player can come across conversations between the previous species and have this little nugget of backstory be delivered to them via a piece of written material. In the end, all it does is enrich the world that the player finds themselves in, which also strengthens their suspension of disbelief when you start introducing some more weird components of the story. I returned back to the temple zone in order to experiment with some additional level geometry. The level up until this point was exceedingly flat, and considering that we have a jetpack, it was probably a good idea to introduce some verticality to the level design. To achieve this, I decided to introduce some vertical pillars upon which I'm going to suspend platforms between which the player will be able to jetpack. Then I switch my gears to something completely different. You see, you, the protagonist, and the Imperial Army officer who's accompanying you have to arrive to this ship somehow. They're supposed to arrive by a small Imperial scout ship, so modeling one was my next task at hand. There were a number of things I had to consider when designing the ship. First of all, the story begins with the player waking up already as a prisoner on board this Imperial scout ship. The player is strapped to the secondary pilot position with all controls disabled, and what was important is that the player has a very clear view from the inside of the ship to the outside. I wanted to make sure that the interior of this scout ship did not obstruct the player's view to the outside, so that when comes the time that the player and the second pilot discover the alien derelict vessel, the view would not be obstructed by any bars or beams or panels. This is an observation I am borrowing from the game called Dead Space 1, where in the intro sequence the player has a very clear view of the ship they're trying to land on. The next thing I wanted to tackle on is the 3D modeling of the alien body. Now again, major spoilers warning as of this point, so you can watch it at your own peril. The model is going to be used in 3 distinct places. First of all, when the player unlocks the 3rd section of the alien derelict spaceship, they will discover some kind of a museum. It is a museum of history for this alien race. The bridge is destroyed and the player will be swooped up by a number of drones, which will transport the player from one end of the museum to the other end of the museum. At that point, the player has no movement control, and as he's floating through the museum, dramatic music is playing and lights start coming on one by one, revealing murals depicting various key stages of this alien's race history. The second place is going to be used in a particular pivoting point in the story, a grand reveal of a sort, when the player discovers that all the aliens have perished within a particular religious gathering location where they were trying to save themselves from the particular threat that they were trying to save themselves from. This ties in heavily into the backstory of the alien race as well as the narrative, which unfolds as the player is playing the game. The narrative itself has so many moving components that it's probably going to be best to leave it until another video. So finally, the last place where we're going to be using this model is when the player discovers only one single remaining surviving member of this alien race closer to the end of the game. Having established the basic mesh for the alien, I decided to switch my attention to one of the key mechanical components of the game, which is the oxygen refill station. You see, the player has a limited number of resources: limited fuel, oxygen, health, and boost. While the boost can still be refilled as long as you're touching the ground and you still have fuel in reserve, the oxygen, fuel, and health do not refill automatically. Instead, the player has to make their way back to the scout ship in order to heal themselves, refill the oxygen and fuel using these refill stations. Now, it may seem like we're jumping an awful lot between programming, modeling, level block mesh, level design, prop creation, but to be honest, every object that you see me create takes somewhere between an hour to maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours to make. So from my perspective, when I switch to a different subject, it's more to freshen things up and keep things interesting, because if I spend too much time doing one thing, I'm just going to end up producing crap. With the pillars in place of the level, it was time to come up with the location for that monument. While these vertical pillars provide us with a neat opportunity to place some platforms that we can jump between, it in turn doesn't leave us a lot of space for large obelisk-like objects to be situated on the bottom floor. Considering that this derelict ship has been stuck in space for many thousands of years, we have also put together a number of crumbling wall prefabs. These are basically single flat planes of crumbling wall that we can use as little presets, little kits to build up our temple area. We also spent some time distributing and generating the collision data for these platforms that the player is going to be jumping between, but later on I realized that all this stuff it's all fine and dandy, but without having established a particular goal, obstacle set, and solution set, there's really not a whole lot happening here. Yes, sure, we're placing a bunch of platforms, but what is the player's goal? What are they supposed to do? At this point, I've just been creating the individual components that I can build up the level, but there's no particular goal or motivation for the player to actually get up there other than to explore. And simply wanting to explore is never a valid enough motivation for the player to get up these platforms. This is something that I have not really thought about up until this point, because up until this point, I've just been concentrating on some basic mechanics, some building blocks, foundation of the movement and platforming experience. I received the model submission from Anthony, who was working on the Jetpack model. This is supposed to unlock the Jetpack abilities for the player once they reach that particular point in the story and are told to pick up the Jetpack to give them more mobility. We play around with the Jetpack force values and inertia values to give the player a sense of freedom, but not make most obstacles void, because the player can just fly over them. This is something that we're going to repeatedly come back to throughout the programming of the game, because we need to dial it in just the right amount. We don't want the player to be able to scale the entire level in one single jump. We also don't want it to seem like the jetpack is barely doing anything. And it's one of those things that's kind of vital to set up early on, because if the entire level is going to be built around the height values that the player is capable to scale, then once we change those values, most of the platforming would have to change as well. Then to switch gears, I decided to model the alien data tablet. Now, this is the primary method that the player is going to be acquiring information about the alien race, about their story. Through the conversations between the aliens, the player will be able to assemble the key components of their backstory, their conversations, their stances on certain subjects, the internal conflicts, receive useful hints on how to overcome certain obstacles, set up the next goal the player is supposed to be targeting, lay down some exposition, character information, and so on and so forth. Since we've established that the technology this alien race uses is primarily built out of stone and crystals, the design of this tablet follows that logic as well. After finishing the design of the alien tablet, we move on to the pickup animation and the interaction mechanic, and finally wrap things up by implementing the user interface to be able to actually read the data on this tablet. Now, each tablet is essentially supposed to contain one conversation between a certain set of alien members of this society. In order to tie the loose ends of how the player is actually capable of interpreting this information, considering that the alien race would probably not be speaking English, I've considered implementing a decrypting minigame, where the player has to collect written pieces of information for a scanner device, almost like something you would find in Subnautica, where you had to scan multiple instances of the same object in order to get the full picture, a full data set, in order for the information to become legible. What I'm considering is essentially a minigame where every next tablet in every next zone is going to be slightly more complex to decrypt. There would be a minigame that would require you to pin together a set of nodes with straight lines. Now, every time the player collects a written piece of alien writing, like for example, some writing on a stone, some writing on a texture, or some writing on the mural, maybe some sort of notation under a painting, some written description of a mural, the player is going to receive a single decryption point. Then, when the player comes around one of these data tablets, a minigame opens up where the player has to decrypt the tablet by connecting nodes with some straight lines. Now, you have to make sure that you connect the nodes in the right order. And of course, if there's a lot of nodes, it would make the task a lot more difficult. And that's exactly where the decryption points come in. The player can make use of the decryption points and sacrifice one to destroy one of the decryption nodes, making the entire process of decrypting a tablet a lot easier. Because this is basically a puzzle adventure game with some elements of horror, I'm looking to gamify a lot of the routine tasks you would be performing in the game, such as reading data tablets would usually give you not only background information about the lore and the backstory of the alien race, but also contain a hint among the conversation on how to solve a particular problem, or how to overcome a particular obstacle, or even where the player is supposed to go next. This makes it vital that the player actually seeks out and reads these data tablets. And because they know that data tablets contain vital information, not just some background exposition that's completely useless to them progressing through the game, they might actually be motivated to also seek out all the written information they can find throughout the level, so that they can make their life easier when they need to decrypt each and every tablet. This potentially has an interesting side effect where the whole mechanic simply makes our life easier, so we don't have to keep finding excuses to give the player some sort of an exposition dump. The player is going to be looking for any written piece of data so that they can get that decryption point. When they scan the piece of data, whatever they scan is still going to be translated, which means most likely it is still going to be read. Since I was already working on the data tablet that day, I figured I might as well wrap the day up by completing the user interface when we actually read the data tablet, go ahead and program its interaction, and test things out to see how it reads. As of this point, I have not yet programmed the decryption mechanic or the data collection mechanic, but I reckon that shouldn't be too difficult of a task. At that point, it was the end of the day. I was kind of tapped out, so I decided to spend the rest of the episode kind of writing up a quick conversation between two aliens talking about one of their younglings getting into trouble and getting into the core room, which actually would motivate the player to explore the core room next. In the conversation, the aliens describe a particular loophole that the player could also use to get into the core room of the vessel. For now, this conversation was purely improvisational. I will most likely be rewriting everything that's there. It was mainly done as a test to see if the text is legible enough and if the interaction feels fluid enough. And after moving around some user interface items in the screen space to make sure that nothing is awkwardly overlapping one another, I feel like the tablet interface came out quite well. We end up returning to the alien project to switch up some gears and model the religious robe, which is going to be prevalent in the museum section of the game, where we can see the history of these alien species. And while we're here, we ended up doing some rigging on the alien character. This is of course vital if I want to make my life easier when I'm going to be posing the various statues within the museum section, as well as positioning and posing all the dead aliens within the final hours of the game, and for animating the alien captain. In order to pose the alien within their robes easily, we're gonna have to rely on the Blender's cloth simulation and simulate the movement to get the cloth to settle in the right pose, and then export a static mesh. I can tell you the museum section is gonna be a pain in the butt because there's a lot of poses that we need to create to depict the story. I've tried to compress this as much as possible using the storyboarding tool, but that still leaves us a good dozen and a bit poses that we have to put together. The next day over, we finally switch things up to program the ability for the player to deploy these drones. Since the player is only going to be able to carry 3 of them, and the first drone the player deploys will automatically snap to the side to act as a large light projector, we had to make sure that the drones are capable of leveling themselves in the level space. Not only that, these drones will serve a vital part of the gameplay loop. The drones have the light source, which allows us to eliminate really dark areas. It also contains a magnetic grappling hook, allowing us to grab large objects and push and pull them apart, clearing obstacles in the way of the player, which means all of this functionality needs to be controlled by the player. The way I was going to introduce this is by giving the player a control panel, almost like a portable television, through which the player can look and see what the drone sees, navigating and flying the drone through the space with a certain range limit, turn the lights on and off, and deploy the grapple hook while targeting whatever it is they're trying to move. I will most likely have to create and train the player to spot some cues, like for example some sort of a hookable object, maybe a metal piece, maybe some sort of a loop that the player will be able to spot and realize, oh yeah, we can actually interact with that object using our drones. Since there are multiple drones involved, we have to have the ability to switch between them. We also played around with the shader material to give it some distortion, added some noise, and added the ability to control the drones while we're looking at the control unit. There is, however, a particular problem that we discovered. Since this is basically making up some sort of an out-of-body experience, you can actually point the camera to yourself and all you're gonna end up seeing is just this floating computer with nothing else in front of it. Which basically means that we are most likely going to have to create some sort of a player model that we can use in place. We played a bit more with the screen shader, introduces a bit of white noise using Krita's own noise generation to create the texture. I ended up making an extensive use of Godot's visual shader tool because this really helps to visualize the shader creation process when you are not too versed in the shader making business. I'm sure that eventually I will move on to code-based shader editing. As a matter of fact, I've already done a few shaders in GameMaker Studio. However, to this day, my shader demands aren't too intensive. Most of my needs are pretty much satisfied by the good old spatial material in Godot, and if I need something specific, it's usually no more than distorting the screen a little bit, so the visual shader node pretty much does the job most of the times. Now, I'm going to cut off the music here for a second because by this point, I've actually gotten submissions from the sound engineer, and holy crap, take a listen to this. Bye-bye. You have got to give credit where credit is due. This guy did an amazing job on his very first submission. Like, holy crap. Like, I know how long it takes to create sound effects, and I think this entire video would have been at least twice as long if I had taken that job on myself. I am really happy that I had come across Noah. He's actually done a phenomenal job. And this is going to be a trend that will continue on to this very present moment as well. Now then, what you see in front of you is me working on the second pilot, the Imperial Army Sergeant, who is responsible for taking us as a prisoner back to the Imperial Army for sentencing. I wouldn't necessarily say that he is the antagonist, but he is definitely an obstacle force that we are going to be pushing against and with whom we're going to end up having to resolve a particular conflict. Besides him, however, there is a much greater threat, which we're going to discover later on. To create the model for this, I used a plugin called Make Human, which used to be a plugin, a part of Blender, but then moved on to becoming a standalone application, which also still offered a plugin that interconnects Blender and Make Human, so you can generate generic human models and then modify them to fit your needs. The process for creating this character was extremely simple. You just play around with a bunch of dials to adjust the general shape, the physique, and the facial features of the character, much like you would in, for example, the character creator in any of the Fallout games. I had a particular idea for a mustache and sideburns for his facial hair, and the general armor I ended up simply creating by extruding parts of his already existing body mesh, the result of which I'm not too certain about. It looks a little bit too much like Slim Jims or spandex, almost a little bit too much like a gimp suit, to be honest. It seemed kind of okay in the beginning, but honestly, the more I worked with this model, the more I realized I don't want to turn my back towards him. So we might just have to come back to this model and redo it. So I might actually want to steer clear from doing any sort of animations for this model until we address that little issue. Texturing this guy was just as much of a breeze as Substance Painter always makes it for me. I absolutely love this program. Honestly, even though that it's a paid program, you can get a lifetime license on Steam, and I honestly highly recommend that you maybe save up some money or ask your parents to gift you this program as a birthday gift. And make sure you stick to the Steam version, because that one's perpetual. None of this subscription license that Adobe is going to be inevitably pushing on us. Luckily, I purchased the software before Adobe acquired Algorithmic, which is the company that developed Substance Painter, and so far, they have promised that they will still continue the perpetual license format for the Steam releases of Substance Painter. So I own Substance Painter 2018, then upgraded to 2020, and now I'm in 2022 because, well, they did introduce a whole bunch of features that did make sense for me to upgrade. Working on the NPC model took some time, so I decided to switch gears to address the next batch of concept artwork that I was supposed to send to one of the 3D modelers. They have submitted a number of small models that I can already place on the level, so it was time to put together the next batch for them to work on. In this particular case, this set of models is essentially a compilation of pillars, walls, and other kit pieces that we can build the residential area out of. It was primarily comprised of walls, arches, and pillars, and was going to be used as a kit to build little homes, little segments in the residential area of this spaceship. With that out of the way, I figured maybe it is time to really switch gears and work on a completely different area of the spaceship. Up until this point, we've been focusing our efforts on the temple area, the very first area our heroes get introduced to. Now, even though we have programmed a whole bunch of stuff and a whole bunch of mechanics and made a whole bunch of models, we still don't have a definitive gameplay loop. What I did know, however, is that after the temple area, the player is supposed to confront the vessel's dying energy core, which means we were most likely going to start working on some core room props. What you see in front of you is a crystal farm, essentially a small pod within which the alien species have been growing the crystals which are used in their day-to-day technology. I made two variations, the short and the long one, which would hopefully allow me to create some interesting mazes, some interesting arrangements. We also take our time texturing these spots in Substance Painter. We had to come up with the soil texture, the stone texture, and of course, the crystal material would have to be built in Godot engine directly, seeing how it employs a bunch of refraction and other effects that we can't really just create in Substance Painter. The presentation of the core room was going to be something that I had pulled inspiration from Half-Life 2 Episode 1, when Gordon has to enter the Citadel's core room and subdue it before it explodes. I thought that was a very interesting concept, and it might actually play well in this particular space adventure game. So my main goal right now was to create the central piece of the entire core room zone, the core containment device. Now, there's been a lot of experimentation for what would the control panels look like and how I would end up arranging the core room, and in the end, I actually ended up scrapping the majority of these model pieces in favor of something a bit more destructive. You will see that later in this video. The core room was supposed to be another obstacle that the player has to overcome, a giant threat that the player has to subdue, essentially by arriving to this alien spaceship and starting to press buttons and move stuff around without knowing what it does. They have disturbed the peace of a dormant core which the aliens had instated in order to protect their main ship core. The problem is that that core was suspended in such a fine balance that the mere arrival of the humans and their unceremonious intervention in the ship's fine balance had thrown the core into an imbalance, which meant it was now ready to explode. This would be something that we have to lay down through lore, through the tablets that the player finds and reads the conversation between the aliens. It would be explained that the core that was currently suspended in the ship wasn't meant to be operated for thousands and thousands of years, and the aliens have indeed been dead for thousands and thousands of years. What this means is that the core that the player ends up disturbing is in such a state of disrepair that player's actions cause it to go into a meltdown. Now, when the player overcomes this particular deed by re-enabling the necessary subsystems to dispose of the core and replace it with a new placeholder which would do the job for the time being, the core room's blinds, which are these massive giant metal/concrete/stone plates that are covering the windows to the outside, would slowly start opening one by one in this dramatic fashion, as if it is now safe to actually peer outside or to let anything from the outside to witness what's on the inside. I must say the final result was actually way better than what I was expecting it to be, but I did have to go through this process of trying to figure out an appropriate solution. I was initially thinking of animating this in Blender, but there were some issues with delta rotations that I had to overcome. It was just not a pretty sight. So instead, what I had ended up doing was create a single blind, program it entirely in Godot using a separate scene and an animation player node, and then manually place each and every one of these blinds all throughout the exterior of the ship. All I had to do then is simply program a little bit of a time delay that would talk to each blind sequentially and tell it to start its animation with a bit of a delay between each and every one of them. Again, the Godot's offerings of various nodes like the animation player node, the timer node, the fact that it has this scene-based system that allows you to just edit everything within the editor, to see the final result of the 3D environment without having to run the game, all of that really came in super handy to developing this effect. It was absolutely the easiest thing that I could ever do in any of the engines that I've worked in before. I also absolutely cannot wait to hear what Noah comes up in terms of the sound effects for these ginormous blinds opening up. My next concern for this area was the fact that the player can just kind of simply waddle on over to the center of the core and start doing whatever they have to do, which is something I haven't yet come up with. What I did know is that I don't want the player to just have a straight line from the beginning to the core. There has to be some sort of an obstacle in the way. So I experimented with this idea of distorting the floor or placing this giant plane of ooze all across the floor to damage the player if they touch it. And and that ooze would be tapped into the lore of the game, where in the conversation between two aliens in the data tablet would explain that if they ran one of these replacement cores for too long, this ooze would start appearing all over the ship, eating away at the ship's infrastructure. So having been dormant for many thousands of years and continuously sucking out the energy out of this long depleted core, which is now grabbing the energy from God knows where, this ooze has basically consumed almost the entirety of the floor on this core room. I would have the opportunity to introduce this ooze in kind of a safe environment as the player is crawling through the ventilation shaft from the temple room into the core room, where the player is going to come into contact with a small sample of this ooze, get a little bit of damage, learn about it, and kind of learn to steer clear from it. And of course, only then, when the player drops down and witnesses the entire floor of the core room covered with this thing, they will have already been trained to know to avoid it. I ended up coming against a problem here where if I had generated this black ooze as one single mesh, I would not be able to generate the collision shape for it that would also be compatible with an area node. You would usually use an area node to detect if the player is contacting some sort of an object, but because of the sheer size and the fact that this is essentially a single plane whose collision shape would undoubtedly have to be of trimesh type, eliminated that type of collision shape from being used in an area node, because apparently area nodes do not work with trimesh collision shapes. They like simple shapes, or at least they like convex shapes. The problem here is that a convex shape would actually ignore all the dips between the hills of this black ooze, which means that we can't have the player walking in between, as he's going to be automatically detected as if he's in the ooze, even though he's not, and that would of course not work. So I ended up instead creating small individual ooze blobs that I can, well, separately place and scatter all over the level individually. The good news is that this particular method also allows me to scale these blobs up and down, so I can use them small little blotches in air vents and ventilation shafts and confined spaces, and then scale them up to blow them up to large giant chunks all over the core room. Now, I went about the creation of the material for this in a way where I used global space or triplanar mapping in order to make sure that when you stretch the object, it doesn't stretch the textures. What this means is that when you grow this object, it doesn't make the texture also stretch. Instead, it just shows more of that texture. And since those textures are perfectly tiled, all you see is just more detail over the larger surface area. I use this particular approach on a bunch of other materials throughout this level, like for example, floors and walls. As long as the surface that we're texturing isn't tilted or crooked in any way, where Godot is actually going to end up blending two versions of the texture together, which ends up actually ruining some of the patterns if you have a pattern on the texture. So far with something like this, with this glassy crystal-like black ooze, it seems to have worked out quite well. I take a short break from working on the core room because I realized that I should probably create a texture for the residential area so that I can send that to Anthony so that he can use it in his current task of making pillars, walls, arches, and other level geometry pieces, which we're going to be using as a kit to build the residential area. For this particular approach, I decided to use Blender's own materials to generate a simple brick pattern, then simply bake that brick pattern into a file, get that into Krita, and simply continue working on it, painting over it, and getting it to the final point there. I have to say, at this point, I'm really glad that I started experimenting with all these programs all those years ago, because now, if I have to create some sort of a texture, some sort of a material, some sort of an asset, I don't have to only be stuck within the one form of medium. Like for example, if I want to create a texture, I don't have to be stuck only in Krita or Photoshop or whatever other program I decide to use. If I'm trying to texture a 3D object, I don't have to be stuck only with Blender's own texturing tools. This kind of brings me on a tiny bit of a rant, but I have experienced so many conversations with people who say open source is king. I only use open source. It's like, well, okay, that's great, but you have to consider how many tools do you have under your belt? Because I'm sure that it's great to have an open source tool, that's fine, But if you're a carpenter, using only DIY tools is going to be a little bit limiting. I mean, what else could you be doing with that time? We're talking about your versatility here, and it's one thing when you can afford to buy the tools but you only say you're only using open source stuff, and another when you can't actually afford it. That's a totally different circumstance. It honestly irks me when I have a conversation with someone and I offer them my impressions of, let's say, a tool like Substance Painter, and then I get a reaction like, wait, what? It's not free? Blah, I only use open source. What I know from my experience is that if I only used open source software, I wouldn't be able to produce this project this fast. Knowing more than just the open source stuff and actually investing into the tools, if you are able to invest, of course, if you have a job and if you can actually purchase these trade tools, it will simply speed up your process in development. Because in the end of the day, if you're in the business of making games, producing this entertainment, optimizing how much time you spend on each asset and being able to shorten that production time is only going to help you. Like, sure, I bought Substance Painter for 120 Canadian dollars. That's when it was on sale. That 120 bucks, it's going to be an immediate cost, yes, but I think I've saved more than enough time by this point, even without making any profit on these games, to say that it was well worth the investment. If these games do turn a profit, it will be an even greater bonus, but the time saving itself, to me, is well worth the asking price. So, we finish up this texture, we send it off to Anthony, and then move on to the next component of the project. I received a model submission from one of the gentlemen that required me to kind of go over it, overview if the model had been set up correctly, if there's any axes and vertices, if there's UV mapping has been set up correctly. Just generally do an overview of the model because I felt that they're actually getting closer and closer and closer to the general approach to the modeling for these types of projects, which is good. There's going to be less rework done, less adjustments to be made. When they actually get on my level of what I expect the modeling to be, it just saves us both time. Speaking of which, now that I have the models in place, I could actually program our fuel refill station, as well as the oxygen refill station on the side of the ship. We're going to see the player coming back to these two stations constantly as the resource the player has access to is fairly limited, and it's something that we'll have to dial in to make sure that the player has just enough playtime to make it enjoyable, just enough time to have some exploration done, but also not enough time that the player can indefinitely spend all the time away from the scout ship and have a reason to come back to. And while they're there, refilling the resources, they would have a reason to also interact with the second pilot. We also do a little bit of modeling on the staircases. I wanted to chump out a couple of chunks of giant staircase slices from each side, just to make the destruction look a little bit more believable. Also, to try to push the whole sensation of a desolate land, I tried to put together a very simple outline texture of some dried up shrubbery. Wasn't really anything complicated, just paint some sticks, some branches, give them a little bit of lighting, slap them on 3 planes inside of Blender, and pluck them all over the level. To make the bush look a bit more three-dimensional without actually committing any extra vertices, I ended up pushing this texture into Mind Text, which helped us generate a normal map, which effectively is going to be interacting with the lighting and shading the branches in a way that it looks like it's three-dimensional without it actually being three-dimensional. Next, I wanted to explore the idea of how the player is going to get into the next zone, the vessel core room. Since I've already laid down some conversation data in the alien tablet below that one of the younglings had climbed into the core room using some air ducts because they were at the time small enough to do so, this would basically tell the player, oh, there's a way to get into the core room using the air ducts. So off to modeling the air ducts I went. As the player's climbing through the air ducts, I ended up carving this tiny little window through which the player is going to be able to get a bit of a glimpse of what's coming in the next zone. At the time, the idea seemed to be pretty interesting, but now that I kind of think about it, once we place the lights and the core and the glow, it's just kind of giving away too much too early, in my opinion. What this duct will, however, serve a purpose for is teaching the player about the black ooze that is scattered all over the core room. We're going to sprinkle a few bits of black ooze across the air duct, and if the player touches it, the player is going to receive some damage, teaching them that you're supposed to stay away from this stuff. It'll be the first time they've ever encountered this as well. So teaching them about this stuff in a more or less safe environment before they encounter the literal sea of it in the next zone over, hopefully we're going to eliminate the cases where when the players drop down into the core room, they look at this black ooze stuff, they wonder what it is, jump right into it, die, and lose a bunch of progress. By teaching them about the stuff just a little bit early on, maybe they're gonna avoid doing that stuff and avoid breaking the immersion, which is very important for us to preserve. The player emerges from the air vents by dropping down into the core room. Now, initially they dropped straight to the floor, but I really wanted to have the player have a very good view of the core central piece, the actual aggregate that holds the sun core in place. So what I've done is place this platform onto which the player drops down when they emerge from the air vents, and it is positioned in such a way that when the player walks through the air vents and drops down into the opening, the vessel's core control aggregate is square in the middle of the player's view, rays and all. It makes the component very hard to miss because the player is going to be moving through the air vents in such a way where by the time they drop out, it's just oriented in front of their screen right away. Now, technically, the control room is going to be the first place where the player comes into contact with the main antagonist of this entire tale, which is the higher level alien race who had created the ultimate source of power in order to lure any and all other races that have become advanced enough to detect that level of power. These aliens are represented as stone statues, borrowing their general outlook from the totems of the native Indian tribes. I always found the aesthetic of native masks and totems to be very, I would say, almost fear-inducing. And that is the exact quality that I decided would suit the general look of this particular alien species. So what we have done here is we've sculpted a high poly model of the alien body and several different variations of the alien heads. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna mix and match the same body and different head to get some variety out of these alien totems. They're mostly gonna be standing enemies. They're gonna be still enemies until, of course, certain scripted events happen and we're gonna start seeing them move around while we're not looking. Now, we're not actually going to be using the high poly bodies directly in the game. Instead, the high poly data is going to be baked as normal information onto low poly models, which themselves are the ones that are going to be used in the game. It's a very common practice in game industry to sculpt very high detail, very high resolution model with all the wrinkles, all the crevices, all the cracks, all the bumps, scrapes, and bruises in full 3D, and then make a low poly model and bake the high detail into the low poly model as normal map data or height map data. This gives the model an illusion of being hyper detailed without the actual cost of large poly count. We end up repeating this process for all 5 head designs and the body design, and I have to say, once again, this is where Substance Painter just absolutely outshined Blender in terms of texturing. The Baker, I don't know what kind of unicorn magic Algorithmic had put into the Substance Painter Baker, but all it took is one try and a couple of slider adjustments, and I got perfect bakes. For whatever reason, I just couldn't get nearly the same results with Blender's internal Baker. So, these alien totems, so to speak, these are smaller scouts of the invading alien army. Canonically, because the alien vessel did not fully enter the rift, it became lodged in the middle of it, plugging it up with its giant body. This meant that the only types of invading aliens that could still make it through were the smaller scout class enemies. This is the reason why the player will never see large, colossal, Titan-class alien masks until the very end of the game, when they finally get access to the front of the ship, and the front of the ship happens to be the part that's actually lodged partway into the rift. What I'd like to borrow here is the concept of the enemy is only active while you are not looking at it, kind of like what you get with the Doctor Who's Weeping Angels. The problem I have to address is that I don't want to immediately introduce that mechanic. As a matter of fact, I want to introduce these aliens in a much more creepy fashion, where when the player is in the middle of disposing of the sun core in the core room of the alien vessel, when the deed is done and the core is disposed of and is replaced by a new one, the player would turn around and for the very first time see a row of these aliens standing just out of reach, unable to get to the player. I don't want them to move, I don't want them to show any sign of them being alive, I just want them to be in the places where they weren't before. Not only that, when the player arrives to the alien vessel, there are none of these aliens in sight. This is because we need to make so that it is the player's actions that release these aliens from whatever confines they were lodged in and lured into by the owners of this alien vessel. How I'm going to pull off that creepy introduction is yet to be seen. I haven't really tackled that question yet. All I know is that I want it to be innocuous. I want it to be almost unnoticed by the player until the last minute. I just want to achieve a sensation that something's not quite right. Something is here that wasn't here before. Stepping away from the aliens for a moment, I got an idea for a particular light fixture that you would find in a temple area. I wanted it to have a suspended crystal, which could be disabled for certain areas, so the crystal would be broken, and to be active in other areas. It would be one of those queued events, scripted events, where the player walks into an area and then a crystal rises up and lights up the room sequentially one after another. Thinking about various approaches to narrative design, one of the ways I thought would be really cool to deliver a certain portion of the narrative would be through murals, large artistic depictions of religious activities or historical events. I had a lot of fun putting these together, and not only are they an effective way of giving a little bit of exposition or telling a small portion of the story, they also seem to mesmerize when you see this colossal artistic structure in front of you. At this point, we've already established that there's going to be 3 key areas in the vessel: the temple, the museum, and the core room. So I think at this point, it might have been a good idea to label and segment the entire ship structure into all the segments that we're going to have to build. A sort of a floor plan of where each segment is going to go. We ended up with the zones for temple, core room, engineering deck, history museum, residential dorm, Research and Development Center, the Contemplator Dome, and the Vessel Control Room. Having decided on what zones we're going to have scattered throughout the ship, we can then design the gameplay loop to take place within these zones. Since we're dealing with an alien spaceship, I figured these particular areas will provide us with more than enough raw material to come up with interesting game mechanics and areas to explore. This is by no means a de facto way of how you can come up with your gameplay loop and areas that you'd like the player to visit. You could always start with the game mechanics first and then wrap them around in the interesting environments that you come up with later. As of this point, I've already been working on the core room for a couple of days, so I figured I'll switch my attention to blocking out the museum area. This is the historical museum where the player gets introduced to the backstory of the alien race, which happens shortly after the player discovers that this is indeed an alien ship. Up until this point, the Imperial Army's officer and the player, having a conversation between one another, simply contemplate that this vessel must belong to one of their warring factions. Noting the abundance of religious phenomena, they decided that this might have been the ship belonging to this one particular highly religious human splinter cell that has been the pain in the ass of the Imperial Army for many decades. And it is not until the player resolves the issue in the core room, returns back to the Imperial Sergeant to report what happened, and they both open up the doors to a certain educational facility and find an alien corpse inside, is when they actually realize that this is not a human-made vessel. As of that point in the narrative, the cat's already out of the bag, so we're finally free to tell the backstory of the alien species whose ship we have just boarded. This entire section of the ship that's dedicated to the historical museum of this alien race is supposed to invoke a sense of colossal presence, huge history. After all, almost a fifth of the entire ship has been dedicated to this museum. It is their legacy. Not only that, throughout the conversations in the alien data tablets, there will be multiple references to their past, to what they have lost, to what there used to be, and the internal conflict of some of the factions disagreeing with where the mission of this vessel is now taking them. Another rule of narrative design is that if you ever want to tell a very important piece of information to your viewer, listener, reader, or player, do so through conflict. So by nesting an ideological conflict between multiple factions within this alien race, we sow the seeds of arguments through which we are free to deliver whatever information we want. This is the secret of narrative design. Everybody likes conflict. Everybody likes drama. Why do you think there's so many drama channels on YouTube? Because everybody likes drama. We're wired to follow an interesting dramatic turn. There's nothing more entertaining in this world than a good scandal. And you can piggyback off of that concept, off of that basic human behavior, to deliver whatever information you want. Do you want to tell the story how some of the people of this alien race do not agree with the decisions of the elders? That's fine. Make an argument that if they keep talking like that, they're gonna get thrown into the airlock. As a matter of fact, the little placeholder conversation between two alien characters in the temple area discuss how the player is capable of going into the core room by using the air ducts. Well, the whole point is presented by the fact that one of the aliens who's responsible for their duties in the core room is complaining that he's a good family friend, but if he finds his nephew climbing through the airlocks to get into the core room and getting him in trouble, he's going to report it, and that is a deadly thing. So never underestimate the power of conflict as a tool for narrative delivery. While we were on the subject of working on the museum, I decided to finally texture the religious robes as well as the body of the alien figure we've designed earlier. Since the first area I'll be working with is the museum, I figured I'll just go ahead and texture it using the marble material. Just before we could texture it, we simply had to fix up some of the seams along the edges of the religious robes. And because this is the first time I've ever had to texture a piece of clothing, I ended up redoing the UV map a bunch of times until I found just the right ratio that skewed and distorted the texture the least, and the rest was handled by Substance Painter's own tools. Having finally finished the alien body rig and the necessary materials for the stone textures, I was finally able to take a look at the level as a whole, and it dawned on me that the entrance to this area seems just a little bit too plain. Maybe it shouldn't be just a straight line. Maybe instead it should descend downwards through a set of steps, and there we can actually then employ a set of cascading lights that turn on as you enter the museum area. After all, by this point the player had replaced the dying sun core with a fresh temporary one, so there was no reason why we couldn't implement some interesting automated features now. In the end, my idea was to make a staircase that descends down into the half-collapsed side of the museum, place some sort of a control panel with which the player would have to interact, and that's when the player would get scooped up by a set of drones carrying him to the other side of the museum, during which the player would be able to witness the entire history of the alien race as it unveils in real time in front of them through a set of murals, dioramas, and statues. With the new entrance geometry in place, it was time to tackle the actual lights themselves. Now, the way I approach these lights and a lot of other passive environment objects that have some life or movement to them is I program them with a particular trigger function. I animate this particular light to have the crystal slowly rise up, gradually enable the light energy of the node, and make the crystal glow with a custom material. All of that would be achieved by a particular function call. I usually call this function the same across all objects that have to be triggered by something. I call the function trigger. There was a particular challenge that I had come across when I was setting up the glowing material. Because you have multiple of these lights all sharing the same material, if one starts glowing, all of them start glowing because all of the crystals share the same exact material. Now, we can't exactly have each and every single crystal have a unique material because if you have, let's say, 50 of these light sources, that means 50 unique materials, and that is not good for performance. So I had to have a bit of a compromise. I had to take out the glowiness of the material and instead use the light sources, omni-lights, in order to giving that material just a little bit of transmission, which allows the light to pass through it and illuminate the material just a tiny bit. It wasn't really the effect that I was going for, but as a compromise, I think it gets me a middle ground. The whole idea is that when the player enters this area, the entire museum is pitch black. Right now we can kind of still see a bit of the silhouettes in the background for some of the statues. That is something that we will handle using the environment node. Everything is going to be pitch black until the cutscene starts. So at this point, realistically, since we've already set up the museum section, we were just right up against the point where the scripted event, the reveal of the backstory for the alien race, was supposed to have been programmed. Which means, if I want to not waste my time creating useless props that I might end up discarding, it's probably going to be a good idea to establish the storyboard of the history for this alien race, which is going to be told through statues, murals, and dioramas. It has to be short, it has to be effective, and it has to be communicating the idea very clearly. At this stage, if I just rush into it and start modeling things right away, I'm most certainly gonna screw it up. And if I don't, there will certainly be a lot of redundant material that I will waste my time on. I'm using an open source piece of software called Storyboarding. It is the first piece of software I've come across when I was searching for apps specifically made for that, and I gotta say, I really like it. It involves some very clever little tools, like for example, keeping track of how much you have been drawing each panel and telling you when it has been enough and that you have to move on to the next one. Because it's actually very important. You're not drawing Mona Lisa here, you're trying to create an abbreviated storyboard of the narrative you're trying to tell. It's not supposed to be pretty, and it's not supposed to be intricate, and the tools and reminders within the software make a good job of reminding you of that. And it may very well be the reason why it only took me maybe a day, maybe a couple of hours to create the entire storyboard for the history of the alien race. Because last time I did this, it actually took me an entire day of a 3-day game jam just to create an introductory comic book for telling the exposition of the story. Good lord, that was a waste, and that was a huge lesson for me to learn too. I mean, the comic book came out okay, but the entire story of that could have been told in 5 panels as opposed to 30. So you can kind of tell why I value tools like this. Each and every board here represents a particular point in the history of the alien race. It covers their struggle, it covers their loss, it covers their transformation, and it covers their conquest. The player had only just found out that this is an alien spaceship, so the primary goal of this museum is to effectively tell the player the backstory of the alien race. Now, at this point, we've been working on the general level geometry and the props for a while, and we haven't really addressed the basic game mechanics for a little bit. So this is where I came up with an idea of how the player is supposed to interact with the technology in this alien ship. Since the technology of this alien ship is primarily stone-based, I figured an optimal way to have the player interact with it is by using crystals. This prompted an idea to create a control panel object, which, if the player has interacted with one before, anytime they see one, they will know that they can approach it and use it to interact with some sort of a piece of technology in the area. Now, the way the panel was designed is that it's actually initially blank. It's basically just a flat surface, and onto that flat surface we can place the receptacles that accept a particular shape of a crystal. We'll have a number of crystal shapes as well as a number of crystal colors, and you have to set up the correct crystal into the correct receptacle, and if the crystal matches and the color matches, the crystal will start to glow. Because the control panel and the crystal receptacle are separated from one another, this meant that I can use these receptacles not just on control panels, but also on other objects, like besides doors, or besides machinery that needs to be operated with a single crystal, like light sources. The panel is actually set up in such a way where we can place into it any number of receptacles, of course limited by the general size of the control panel. And as soon as the code runs, the ready function scans all the receptacles within the control panel and pairs them to be scanned every time a crystal is deposited. This means I don't have to program each and every control panel that I place throughout the entire game. It's a very modular approach to programming these objects. It makes them highly reusable throughout whatever challenges you'd like to place in a particular level, and the only requirement is that I need to specify the target that the control panel is supposed to be triggering, and that target needs to have a script with a function called trigger. Those are all the requirements. Once all the crystals have been placed, the panel performs a scan. It then checks if all the crystals have been correctly inserted, if they're of the correct type and correct color, and if everything matches, if there's just as many correct crystals as there are receptacles, the panel is going to address the target node using an export variable and execute its trigger function. Now, I'm guessing as a part of an intermission, we had a bit of an argument with the folks of what the alien light sources should be like, so I decided to take a moment, maybe take a break and do some modeling and see if I can figure out what would a light source in a place like this look like. Something like a street lamp or a park lamp. Ended up with this interesting looking, almost lantern-like design, almost akin to a gas lantern you'd see in the parks back in 1800s. Coming back to the crystal receptacles, I actually had to employ quite a lot of Python scripting in order to perform batch conversions, batch displacements, and batch renaming operations, because there was actually a lot of these receptacles, considering that there were a lot of crystals that were submitted by one of the modelers. I gotta say, knowing Python in this case was just a lifesaver, because if I had to export and process these objects manually, I would shoot myself. Now, when it comes to texturing for these crystal receptacles, I decided to lay them out in a single file, in a single row, with a decent enough distance between one another, and texture them all at once. First of all, we don't really need a separate texture file and a material for each and every one of these receptacles. They're all pretty much the same. They're all using the same material. They will have a little bit of a difference based on their shape and the receptacle slot, but because we're using Substance Painter, detecting the differences in the shapes and placing things like edge damage, dirt accumulation, and dust is a breeze. Considering that we came up with about 16 receptacles, having to import and export each and every one of them, create a blank Substance Painter project for each and every one of them, export a color map, normal map, bump map, roughness map, metallic map for each and every one of them, would have been a hell of a dumb thing to do. So if you can combine multiple assets, especially if they're very similar, into one single texture, it'll save you resources, it'll save you time, and if you do a little bit of Python programming, it'll make your life a lot easier. By the time we finished working with the receptacles textures, we had also set up the player grabbing mechanic, the player's ability to pick up objects, carry them from one point to another, and place them into the receptacles. It was important to make sure that we programmed the receptacles and the crystals to recognize each other. Now, we achieved that by assigning both the receptacle and the crystal a set of export variables, so that we could tell the receptacle, you're supposed to accept this type of a crystal at this type of color, and we could go to the crystal and say, you're going to be of this shape and this color. So when the two meet together using an area node, they're going to check one another, or technically the receptacle is going to check the crystal, and if it is of a correct type, it will initiate a tween-based animation that first positions the crystal, then rotates to align it to a correct angle, and then slots it into the receptacle, thus marking it as enabled. We set up the statues to appear in this area, however, we still have a problem that they're very quite clearly visible as soon as you enter this area. They're not supposed to be. So what I had done is set up a reusable area node, almost like a trigger zone or trigger area. When the player steps into one of these trigger areas, it interacts with our lighting system. Now, what we've done here is we've set up a number of scripts that are going to smoothly transition various environmental properties like ambient lighting, ambient texture, fog start, fog end, fog color, intensity, and it's gonna play around with them based on which zone you're currently located on. Are you in a temple zone? Well, you're supposed to have a little bit of ambient light because there's a giant gaping hole in the side of the spaceship. Are you inside of this museum area? Well, you're not supposed to see these statues yet, so we're going to turn down the amount of ambient light all the way to 0, and we're also going to go ahead and hide these statues from plain sight. These statues are supposed to be kind of a mini reveal, so I don't want the player, who obviously has his own flashlight, and of course they have the drone flashlight projectors, from being able to see these statues prematurely. I can either achieve that by turning into some sort of an animated cutscene as soon as the player enters the zone, which isn't something I'm too fond of, or I have to do some trickery and I have to hide these statues until the player is actually captured by the drones and being transported to the other side. So now that we've instated the ability to pick up, carry, and deposit the crystals, comes the question of how is the player supposed to find them? Now, we could place the crystals in certain areas where the player is able to see them right away, and then it's just a case of maybe picking them up and trying to mix and match and see the ones that fit. It's sort of a mini puzzle, but what if we try to push that even further. I mean, we do still have the ability to place them whatever we want in plain sight and just have the player pick the ones that fit and place them. But what if there's also some sort of a search mechanic that we have to employ? Maybe there's some certain hidden areas that the player would have to discover. Well, this is where this little gadget idea comes in. I've yet to test how effective it really is, considering that I'm the one who's placing crystals and I'm also the one who's searching for them. It's a little difficult to tell if this is a very effective mechanic, but essentially this is going to be an energy scanning radar. If the crystals are scattered all over the immediate area, all you have to do is point this radar in a particular direction and it will tell you if you are facing the direction of some sort of an energy crystal, as well as telling you how far you are away from it. This is akin to the radio scanner in Outer Wilds, where you point it to a random point in the sky and there's a set of markers that appears on the screen telling you if you are aligned with some sort of a radio signal. Now, in Outer Wilds, that radio scanner is actually capable of showcasing the alignment with multiple radio signals at the same time. In my case, you only get one particular signal that is dominant. If there's multiple signals around, you will only see if you are close enough to a particular signal. Now, this might actually cause problems because if you already explored a particular signal, it will muddy up your ability to find other signals because you'll point it in that direction and you'll think it's something new, but nope, it's just the same old thing that you've already visited before. So the way I'm thinking of tackling this particular problem is by introducing an ability to exclude certain objects from being scanned by this scanner device. All you have to do is walk up to an object that you have previously scanned, press a button, and from that point on, the scanner will ignore that object, unless, of course, you decide to walk up to it again and press the button one more time, which will re-add it to the list of scannables. Now, this scanner is actually capable of telling you about multiple sources of energy. The problem is that there's only one dial and it's only capable of pointing to the most dominant power source. So whichever crystal, for example, or data tablet you're pointing the closest would be the crystal or data tablet that will be dictating the values for the dials. And the biggest problem with this is that if you have multiple crystals that are kind of next to one another, or even if you just have a lot of crystals all around the player, then technically that little needle that determines if your angle is correct is just all the time pointing to the max. Which is, of course, pretty gosh darn useless, because if all the angles you look at happen to be at the maximum, that means, well, none of them are useful, right? You might as well just pick a random direction and go there. So somehow we had to pinpoint it in such a way where you had to be at least within the general vicinity of looking at a correct angle before the device's needle starts moving up, indicating that you're actually looking in the general direction of an energy source, and maybe if you rotate and tilt the device a little bit, you will pinpoint that location. We needed to do something about the sensitivity. It's kind of like if you have a metal detector that is too sensitive and you have this grid of nails, it's just going to keep telling you that, yep, you're standing right on top of a nail, even though clearly you're standing in between two nails. Now, believe it or not, the solution to dialing in the sensitivity ended up coming from one of the Godot engine's resources called a curve texture. You can quite literally create a new resource called curve texture, then load it up into your program using the preload command, and then all of the functions for that curve are available to you to do as you please. In our case, we have projected the angle difference, which tells us how close or how far away we are from looking at a correct angle, onto the x-axis, after which we had proceeded to set up the curve to determine what kind of a y value are we going to get based on which x value we're currently looking at, which means it quite literally allows us to convert one range of values into a completely different range of values in a non-linear logarithmic scale. So quite literally adjusting the sensitivity curve of our scanner. Do you realize the kind of shit I had to do to achieve the same level of control in GameMaker Studio? We literally had to use character paths to achieve the same level of control, and it was a bitch. So after setting up the angle detector, the distance detector was actually quite a lot easier because there was no need for any logarithmic transformations for the sensitivity of how far we are away from the object. There's a particular range to these scanners, so that range essentially became the maximum distance, at which point the needle would be at its lowest. And of course, if it's at its highest, that means we're standing right on top of the damn thing. Now, due to a quirky shape of this dial, of this indicator, I decided to use path 2D and path follow 2D to move the needle along the way to indicate how far we are from the object. Again, due to the brilliance of the Godot engine's node setup, the path follow 2D node offers to us the offset in pixels and of course the offset in scalar values from 0 to 1. That makes mapping values onto this path node extremely simple. Now, after a quick little test, I had actually realized that the dials for the angle and distance happened to be way too far to the side of the screen based on the position of the scanner. Now, this is generally not good because the eye is going to end up darting between where the player is looking, which is forward center, and to the side of the screen just to see where it is that the dials are, where the indicators are. That's not good. This is where I took a moment to observe how Outer Wilds ended up handling it, and in their case, you're always looking in the middle of the screen, and the indicators that tell you how well you are aligned to the radio signal are also smack in the middle of the screen, just separating to the left and right, which basically means that the eye never has to leave the center of the screen, the action zone, so to speak, just to check how well you are aligned with the signal. Now, in order to facilitate the same level of comfort when checking for the signal quality, I decided to add some pipes and move the indicators closer to the middle of the screen once the object is held by the player. Sure, it required me to kind of sodomize and remodel a part of it, but to be honest, it is well worth it. I would even go so far as to say that it came out way better than if the dials were to the right side. It's functional, it's comfortable, and it just feels right. So take my advice, if you play some award-winning games, pay attention to what they do right. Borrow the good ideas and build up on them. After the modification, I thought it was time to get this sucker textured, and something that I actually noticed is that the extreme low light level in certain zones of the environment actually make it kind of hard to read where the needles are located. So for the needles, I decided to go with a backlit display, which even in the darkest zones would still allow us to very clearly see where the needles are on the dials. Now, at this point, I felt that I started running out of ideas for the museum area, so I ended up switching my attention back to the core room to see if we can introduce some floor destruction. We wanted to make it more challenging for the player to reach the core room, so we had to end up offsetting it a little bit further, and technically on the opposite side of the core room there's supposed to be a door, but it will be destroyed, so the player won't be able to just skip immediately to the control room of the ship. They have to go the long way. They have to go through Ravenholm to get there. Since this is pretty much a 3D platformer at this point, we got the jetpack, we got the oxygen and fuel, I figured floating rocks might actually work quite well. And of course, we still have the black ooze to spread everywhere, so perhaps the very bottom of the ship is going to be all black ooze that the player has to avoid. And of course, after this, for an unbeknown to me reason, I decided to make my own font. I don't remember why I decided to do it, but all I remember now is that, boy, did I waste a lot of time. I believe at the point I couldn't really find an open source font that I can use for the project, so I decided, hey, why don't I just design my own? And I can already feel the collective typeface designers watching this video going, yep, I know, I had to find out the hard way. Designing a font is a huge pile of work, and honestly, I have a whole new appreciation for type designers. It took forever to set up a proper font, and there's so many quirks and exceptions you have to think about. And in the end, the font sucked! So yeah, trust me, just pay the license for a proper font. Just do yourself a favor. Don't torture yourself! At this point, I thought of experimenting with the presentation of the black ooze. I just wanted to see what other options I can come up with. I had this idea for a glowing rock. It kind of came from a very old experimentation project in Unreal Engine when it came to glow in emissive maps. I think I might even have some extremely old videos of those experiments on this channel, buried somewhere far into the ether. I gotta say, it was fun coming up with what it would look like, but it didn't really come out looking all that great. While working on this zone, I realized that by the time the player comes out of the air duct, which is just a short little hike, the player just has way too easy of a time getting access to the core room. Not only that, at this point we haven't really even motivated what causes the core of the vessel to essentially go haywire. So I figured instead of having the player just drop down and have direct line of sight with the core, we're gonna have the player drop into a sort of a control booth within which the core was regulated by the alien engineers. The booth is going to be locked away from the core, essentially sealed with its own set of shutters, and when the player starts finagling with the controls, he ends up disengaging the safety nets installed by the aliens to prevent the core from entering a meltdown when it's depleted, which most importantly from a narrative standpoint means that the core doesn't go into meltdown because it just happened, it goes into meltdown because of human intervention and players' actions. Most of my narrative design comes from my father, who is a scriptwriter, and one of the points that I've been taught that relates to this particular scenario is that if something happens, that something has to be motivated. You can't have events in your narrative design happening just because the stars aligned that day or the universe decided it's gonna happen this way. That is the equivalent of the writer throwing a farce and just saying, screw the rules, I just want to do it this way. And that's when bad writing actually creeps in. I do have to note that at this point I'm still working on just a prototype, so from a narrative standpoint I don't have a script that I'm abiding. I'm simply experimenting with level design and gameplay mechanic ideas, but you can see that once you know the rules of narrative writing, you can employ them in your designs as well so that it makes sense and you don't end up creating a level and then wonder, well, how do I tackle on a story onto this gameplay now? So it was right around this point when I realized that I didn't really like the purple glowing rock because it actually detracts from the centerpiece of this entire room, the core. The core is supposed to be the central piece and nothing around that view is supposed to detract from it. So all I had to do is get rid of the glow material and oh god, he's working on the font again. Come on man, haven't you learned enough? You have way too much other crap to do to be worrying about this. Come on, chop chop. I continued my work on the core room. I actually ended up redoing the glass shattering effect so that we can get some bigger chunks that we can have more control over. We do a little bit of work on the interior design of the entire level, set up a backplane and a door. I tried to play with the level geometry in such a way where when the player lands on this platform from the air duct above, the core is going to be smack in the middle of the view, this beautiful presentation, and then immediately I realized, you know what, maybe that's too early to reveal the core. I did like the idea of the player learning about the core in this room, witnessing it for the first time, but I didn't want him to see it this soon. Instead, I wanted to get the player to stay in the room and sink in the environment a little bit more, maybe do a little bit of additional story delivering through a wall mural and some data tablets. And of course, most importantly, piggybacking on the earlier discussion, we wanted to make it so that the core of this vessel going into complete meltdown is the player's fault. So for that reason, I couldn't have the window with a shattered hole be presentable to the player right away, because there's always going to be the chance that they're just going to fly right out of it and just start exploring the surrounding environment without actually triggering the meltdown. And I also didn't want to trigger the meltdown using a trigger zone. The player just steps on this plate and the thing starts exploding. I mean, that doesn't sound as dramatically interesting. I wanted the player to shove a bunch of crystals in the panel he had no idea about, and that is what caused the entire vessel's core to go supernova. Now at this point I had a problem. I had to keep the window unobstructed for the player to see the core, but I didn't want the player to witness the core too early. So we come up with a solution a little bit later on. For now, however, since we're right about at the point when the player is supposed to throw the sun core into distress, I figured I might as well work on the core effect itself. I ended up employing a combination of visual shaders, a little bit of scripting, and a little bit of animation player nodes in conjunction with my earlier introduced trigger zones to make the sun core pulsate. There were a lot of moving parts involved in order to achieve this effect, because there were texture scrolling and distortions we had to perform on the vertex shader level, and the whole thing was supposed to be performed in this cyclic explosion and contraction sort of fashion. On top of that, as the sun core starts exploding, it's supposed to change its color to a more cold color, a more supernova color. Of course, on top of this, I would also have to involve a lot of post-processing effect to get the screen to distort in every which way, but that was gonna come later on. Right now, the sun core was my main point of focus. It took maybe a good 2 or 3 episodes, but we actually ended up getting a very nice effect. As a matter of fact, I liked this effect so much that I didn't find it acceptable that there was a whole bunch of level geometry just obscuring the vast majority of this effect. I mean, for crying out loud, this is a miniature sun trying to go supernova. You bet your bottom butt is gonna melt a bunch of stuff. And this gave me an idea that was gonna work a little bit later on. Instead of leaving it as it is, I decided to motivate the reason why the star keeps exploding and expanding but then immediately contracting back to a sun state instead of going supernova. The idea was to create a set of suppressor arms, which are gonna get activated as soon as the sun starts going supernova. When it starts going supernova, a burst of energy is emitted, powering up a set of capacitors, which is what I ended up modeling in this video. These capacitors will accumulate enough energy in order to provide power for the suppressor arms, and just before the sun core goes full supernova, the arms come to life and suppress it back to a sun state, keeping this never-ending torturous compression cycle going until the player actually finishes the task of disposing of the core. These capacitor towers are supposed to be interacted by the player, whereas the player is supposed to deposit a number of components into them in order to stabilize them. And it was around this time that I actually realized how I was going to solve the problem of the player witnessing the sun core too soon as they drop into this booth. You see, nothing stops us from placing some sort of a blocking material in front of the booth. So what I decided is to set up a set of blinds, which scale themselves across the entire window in a cascading fashion, which the player will have to interact with the control panel in order to unlock. Now, technically, when the player drops into this booth, he is now stuck. The player is stuck and cannot get out, which means the player's only way out is to experiment, explore, and eventually try to interact with the control panel, which is actually also the very first time the player is ever seeing the control panel in front of them. So we'll have to make sure there's some sort of a tutorial technique used to teach the player how to work with them. Chances are it's going to be delivered through a data tablet that the player reads, which will contain the vital information injected in between some sort of a heated argument between a couple of characters in order to spice up the delivery of the information. The player picks up the correct crystals, inserts them into the control panel, and the blinds go up, and the player has just disturbed the piece of the finely delicate balance of a long since depleted sun core trying to go supernova. Now, before the player gets a chance to unlock the giant blinds in front of the control booth windows, I actually wanted to enrich the environment by placing another mural depicting the aliens operating this core room environment, but also showing the player a sort of a map of this entire room. The purpose of this mural is to also communicate to the player that there is a utility room situated underneath the core aggregate, which means it is the room that the player will have to get access to in order to perform the core replacement procedure. This also happens to be the same room within which, after the player performs a replacement, is going to be filled with numerous totem statues creepily staring back at the player, ever out of reach. Now then, how is this alien vessel is supposed to be preventing this sun core from repeatedly going supernova? Well, what I figured I can do is set up a set of arms which engage the sun core and try to compress it back into a small state of a regular sun core every time it tries to expand and blow up into a supernova. Now, for this particular idea to work, what I wanted to do is engage this sort of a powering up and powering down cycle. You see, the sun core has long since has been depleted, and this is something I'm going to have to communicate through data tablets and some environmental storytelling. Now, what this means is that the suppression system is also offline. So how do the arms come back to life? Well, when the sun core starts expanding into a supernova, it emits a burst of energy, which, as I mentioned before, charge up the capacitors that in turn power the suppression system. All of this is represented by the sun core exploding into a blue supernova, and the arms that meant to suppress the sun core slowly start waking up and struggle to get up under their own weight. They eventually get enough juice to get going, pull back, and compress the sun back to its small state. But if they compress the sun core, that means it has lost that burst of energy it was outputting, which means the suppression system also loses power. What I wanted to do is achieve the arms falling down in as much of a natural way as I could manage, which means I most likely would have had to create an animation by hand, or I could try employ the use of physics simulation in Blender and simulate a physics drop by recreating the general scene of the sun core within Blender's own physics environment, set up some bones, set up some rigid bodies, and connect them using pivot joints, and just let the whole thing drop by itself. I noticed there's a couple of bugs with Blender, especially when you have a particular physics joint. If you try to move it sideways when its axis is only limiting movement along one single rotational axis, it will literally crash Blender, and I've lost a couple of bits of progress that way. But as soon as I learned to not be a dum-dum, the simulation went through just fine. I was able to take the bones and retarget them to the rigid bodies, and that means I could also bake them to have the animation be baked into the keyframes rather than relying on the physics simulation. I think it was important for me to do this test in a small controlled environment to verify that this was something that I could achieve, and now that I got my confirmation, it was time to do this in the real live environment. Well, sort of. You see, I couldn't really get to baking the rigid animation onto the suppressor arms because, well, first of all, there were no suppressor arms, but second of all, I had to make sure that the topology of my level was final, because if there's going to be a point where the arm, while it is dropping, catches on some sort of an object that wasn't there before during baking, well, it's literally going to just clip through it. It's basically not there. It's not real physics. It's just baked animation. So the first thing I had to do is make sure that I am okay with the current level topology. So I had to finalize whatever changes I was going to make, remove all the meshes I was going to remove, add whatever details I was going to add, and that's exactly what we're doing right here. Since I decided that we're going to be using a sun core and we're not going to be obscuring the beautiful explosion effect with any geometry, I had decided to simulate what it would look like if a sun expanded and simply melted all the infrastructure around it. This also gave me a great idea of implementing some emissive maps around the edges to make the metallic objects glow every time the sun core expanded into a supernova and achieved contact with the very parts that it had previously melted. Now, I gotta say, after that entire endeavor with achieving the sun core explosion effect, I was pretty tapped out and I really needed a change of pace into something completely different. So what I decided is to maybe tackle on a little bit of sound effect design of my own. Even though I have Noah doing a absolutely banger of a job putting together all sorts of sound effects for this project, I still wanted to kind of experiment with a little bit of my own. So what I had put together is a set of sound effects for a particular game mechanic I had in mind. We have these giant zones: the history museum, the temple, the core room, the research laboratory, the engineering deck, the control room. All of those zones are separated by giant doors. So how do we open those giant doors? Well, it could be a button, could be a bunch of crystals, sure, but what if we involve a new mechanic? What if each and every one of these colossal doors that separates a zone is locked with a particular melodic pattern? This wouldn't be the first game that I've implemented musical concepts into, but I thought, this might actually be an interesting concept. So this is the sound effect which these colossal doors will emit when the player matches the tone that's required to open that door. Now, you may wonder, how is the player actually supposed to interact with these giant doors to unlock them? Well, the answer to that is very simple. In the beginning of the game, the player will be asked to whistle, and later in the game, having learned how to whistle, the player will have to use that mechanic to find the correct combination to the doors. I was pretty satisfied with the way the whistling mechanic came out, so since I was already at the music writing station, I might as well do some more sound related work, and at that point I decided to create a sound effect for the drone hover state. When the drone is deployed, there has to be some sort of a hum or some sort of a vibrato, some sort of a modulated synth sound that's going to represent that hovering drone actually emitting some sort of a pulse to keep itself upwards. Believe it or not, I was actually just about ready to export the previous sound before I stumbled upon this one. Now, unfortunately, during the recording, something happened to the audio routing and it was just sending two same mono signals to the left and right, which is why the phasing issue occurred, and that's why you can hear the sound to be really weird in the headphones. But the final sound design that came out of this entire experiment actually fits quite well. Take a listen. I don't know about you, but I thought this came out really well. So with that said, it was time to move on to the next step and start modeling the giant suppressor arms that are going to be situated around the center of the core room, suppressing the sun core anytime it tries to go supernova. Now, thankfully, all arms are going to be the same, so all we have to do is model and texture only one set, after which we can duplicate it and propagate it around the core center area, and then use the previously explored physics solution in order to simulate the heavy arms naturally falling down under their own weight and colliding with world environment. This is where we have to be considerate about how we place these arms. We need to make sure that the arms don't obstruct the majority of the view of the sun core. After all, I'm pretty sure the player is not going to appreciate when the center focus of the room is the giant sun core exploding, expanding and contracting, and at the same time it's being obscured by these giant arms. So composition and framing is going to play a role into how we decide to arrange these. So after setting up the Blender's rigid body nodes around the giant suppressor arm, retargeting the bones to always point to the next rigid body to make sure that they align, assigning static collisions to all the level geometry to make sure that when the arms droop they actually collide with the world environment rather than just phasing through it, we were pretty much ready to just hit simulate, let the physics bones fall under their own weight, have them collide with whatever they need, need to, and because the armature and all of its bones will end up following the rigid bodies, all we have to do is click on the armature and bake its motion with the help of the visual keying option during the bake process, which means whatever the bones are visible, that's exactly where they're going to get baked, their location, rotation, and scale data. And that is all that you have to do to convert physics simulation into bone keyframe animation. Now, the physics simulated animation is not the only one that these suppressor arms are supposed to be playing. You see, these arms are, just like the sun core, going to be playing an animation on a cycle. When the sun core starts exploding and expanding, these arms are supposed to awaken from their dormant state, weakly and slowly rise up in different motions, trying to set themselves into position as best as they can with whatever little power they have to work with, pull back and push back on the core. Now, that animation can't really be achieved with physics alone, so for this one, we're hand animating each bone with the very tip of the machine acting as the inverse kinematic control bone, allowing us to move the tip anywhere we want, and their entire arm will follow suit according to its structure. The final animation is essentially going to be a combination of the hand animated wake up sequence followed by a physics simulated power down sequence. Now, when it came down to animating the 3 suppressor arms, I didn't want to just animate one and then copy its animation and propagate it to the others, because that simply felt way too uninteresting. Having 2 of the 3 arms being in clear view when the player is observing the initial explosion that destabilizes the core would pretty much give us a great opportunity to almost give a little bit of a personality to each arm, where each one kind of struggles to get up and perform its suppression duties in its own unique way. You know, stumble around the nightstand, look for glasses, try to find space Viagra, that sort of stuff. In the end, I think the animation came out quite well, and we do have to consider that if we now decide to add additional props throughout the level, we have to be really mindful of the animation, because otherwise we're gonna have to rebake the whole thing. The next day rolls around and we export our suppressor arms from Blender into our Godot project and start setting up the animation. At this point, we have multiple components that need to be synchronized between one another. All the arms need to be triggered at a certain point, and the sun core has to expand and then contract in sync with the suppression animation of the suppressor arms, which means we actually had to set up some uniforms within the shader that is responsible for the sun core expansion effect, and we had to control that value with the animation player node that was responsible for controlling the pacing of the entire thing. Now, once the player triggers the scripted event and throws the sun core into disrepair and it starts expanding and contracting, this turns into a particular gameplay loop cycle. You see, the sun core expands, explodes, goes into supernova, and as it's growing, the player is supposed to take shelter behind some sort of a rock or pillar or some sort of an object that's supposed to protect it from the immense heat coming from the core. Then the arms come up, suppress the sun core, and then the player can continue trying to find a way to suppress the sun core until the next explosion cycle happens. Every time an explosion cycle happens, there's supposed to be a particular screen distortion. Now, I achieved that by creating a sphere, giving it a material within which I enable refraction and assign a normal map into the refractions texture slot in order to ensure that the way it refracts and distorts the world imagery behind it is done in an uneven fashion. I also had to play around with the pacing of the growth effect because I didn't want it to be too fast, but instead have this particular dramatic flair to it. And of course, while I'm doing all this, I'm literally foaming at the mouth thinking what kind of music I'm gonna write to this, because looking forward to that one. God, it's gonna be great. I'm gonna have so much fun. So for this entire episode, we've pretty much been synchronizing all the different moving components between one another. The arms, the shockwave explosion, the sun core expanding, the suppressor arm capacitors are supposed to cue in and start glowing after a certain time. All sorts of moving parts, all triggered by one single event, the player inserting a bunch of crystals into the panel in the core control room. Now, it was around this time that I realized there might be a potential for a really cool effect. If I actually add an emissive map to the suppressor arms, I can literally make them glow under the heat of the sun core as they're trying to suppress it. I already had this effect on the surrounding geometry that has been melted by the sun core, but this is actually going to be just a cherry on top. I'm pretty sure I'm still going to be coming back to this scene, because one thing that I realized is that as soon as the player walks into the core room, the surrounding geometry with all the control panels and pillars are already melted from the get-go, and it may or may not be a particular plot hole, because if the player is the one that throws the sun core into a meltdown, then why is the stuff around the sun core already melted? So I'm probably going to be coming back and adding some temporary placeholder mesh geometry to simulate the surrounding geometry literally melting for the very first time the player sees that initial explosion of the sun core expanding. I can already see how I'm gonna achieve it: some emissive maps, a couple of masks, and alpha clipping in the material, set up a small shader uniform to make the mask grow and thus consume the surrounding environment, maybe get some particles of melted metal floating down into the abyss below as the sun core is literally melting it for the very first time. Yeah, we'll probably come back to this and add some additional effects. And if I wasn't having a great day already, Noah decides to submit the next batch of sound effects, so I immediately decided to implement them right away. This batch of sound effects contained the alien data tablet sounds, the crystal placement sounds, and the core control room shutters rising up sounds. Just listen to this, you're gonna love it. Honest, maybe this shadow. Yeah. Shut up the past you. So anyways, holy crap, this sounds awesome. Can't wait to write the music that accompanies this as well. This is, after all, supposed to be a grand reveal of the core of this entire alien ship. And not only that, this is before we know that this is an alien ship. Up until this point, the player and the Imperial Army soldier think that this is just a piece of technology from their rivaling, warring factions that has managed to develop technology completely beyond its imagination and is now a major threat. It won't be until after this sequence, after we resolve this crisis and return back to the Imperial Army Sergeant with the report, that we finally discover the first dead alien body. There's going to be a lot more effects that we can add here, a lot of sparks, a lot of wind effects. There's also going to be a significant number of screen shake we'll have to add on the vertical plane. Maybe even rework this vertical screen shake, give it a bit more variation, a little bit more life. It's all achieved with sine waves anyways. And of course, we got to set up the threat, and we got to set up the series of obstacles and resolutions, which at this point, we've only set up the initial threat, the ever-expanding core. Now what we need is a series of obstacles and resolutions to propel forward the gameplay loop. At this point, I believe it was just about time I switched gears in order to come back to this later on with some fresh ideas, and I decided to work on the intro cinematic / exposition or introduction of the characters. In order to lay down some groundwork of who, what, when, where, why, the exposition has the player being stuck as a prisoner in a small Imperial Army scout ship being delivered to be sentenced for his crimes of evading the Imperial drafting program. This setup will introduce what the entire game story is about. So we need to introduce characters, timeline, circumstance, and all of that will take place within this intro cinematic of the player and Imperial Sergeant having a heated conversation right at the beginning of the game as they're flying through space awaiting to be picked up by the Imperial cruiser. So the primary focus of this episode was figuring out how I could pair the player camera to the scout ship to make sure that the cinematic takes place from within the scout ship without me having to program an entire new set of player mechanics specifically for cutscene execution. This is where I had to take a look at the player camera, maybe finagle with additional cameras, play around with perhaps retargeting of the player camera motion, but perhaps tie it down in movement so that it's permanently paired to the ship. There has to be some sort of a solution that doesn't require me to create an entire new player just to get this intro cinematic going. Now, within this intro sequence, the player is supposed to be taught some of the basic mechanics, like how to use the radio energy scanner, how to whistle, how to interact with certain objects, and all of that would happen even before he steps foot off of the ship. So it's quite literally everything that the player can do except move around. There were certain issues I had to fix up because the scout ship was supposed to have been a static body, but then in order to get the player camera lined up just right so that the discovery of the alien vessel is in full view and at the same time still have a clear view of the Imperial Army sergeant who is taking you from imprisonment, ended up causing some issues with collision shapes being inside of one another and basically glitching out the physics handler in Godot engine. And at this point, I started to realize why developers rely on these absurd methods of setting up game mechanics in the bizarre most ways, as long as they're not visible to the player's eye. Like, for example, the fact that in one of the DLCs for Fallout 3, the train animation that arrives to the station is literally a hat ornament for an NPC who's walking below ground. In Fallout New Vegas, the location where you witness the slides that deliver the exposition and the conclusion of your adventures in the Mojave Wasteland, dubbed of course by Ron Perlman's smooth buttery voice, is in reality just a small level with some pasty white guy behind the wall basically playing back the voice lines as if you were talking to an NPC. In an interview about, I believe, Oblivion's development for the original Xbox, Todd Howard literally said that they couldn't handle the memory leaks, so what they've done is that when you transfer between levels, they literally cut the screen to black and shut down your Xbox in order to reboot it and clear the memory. Instead of figuring out where the memory leaks are coming from, they literally just said, fuck it, let's just shut down the damn system and make it clear the memory by itself, and it would just work with a blank slate. Now, I don't know if in all these three examples, the fact that the games were using an engine made by Bethesda is a pure coincidence or not, but regardless of the fact, we can all learn something about these approaches. If it works, it ain't stupid. And if it gets the job done without sacrificing anything and saves you on production time without being noticeable unless somebody starts finagling with the game files, then hey, you might as well save yourself the time. So after experimenting with various methods I can try to pull this off, I decided to disable the player's collisions and lock the player movement within the script, only allowing him to look around and zoom. I've also done some experiments with how I would go about animating the scout ship doing a flyby around the alien vessel, and my initial approach was to use path 2Ds and path follow 2Ds along with some control objects to help tilt the ship in the right direction, but in the end I realized that this was not going to provide me with the level of control I needed to pull off an animation of that level. So instead we're going to be using the animation player in order to place proper keyframes for all the rotation and location properties to pull off the animation, and I think that's going to give us way more control over the animation. At this point we were actually delving into some heavy narrative delivery territory, which means this was about the time that I should start putting together some sort of placeholder dialogue so that I can build the conversation system, the dialogue system essentially. Maybe even play around with some additional features like triggering music when you are reaching a certain part in the dialogue, triggering animations, running certain functions. Now, all of that meant I had to create essentially a dictionary that represented the dialogue which the characters go through. And this kind of ties into the dialogue systems that would then perpetuate themselves through other projects that I work on, because all of them have been leaning more and more towards RPG, open world-ish, choose what you want to talk about sort of dialogue systems and quest systems. So I figured I might as well develop a external tool that is gonna allow me to create dialogues for any one of my projects, whatever type or genre of game it is, as long as it uses the same system, and simply work in that. This is something I had attempted to do in Godot engine using all the user interface nodes. Back in the Child of Ether project, I was trying to do this as a built-in editor, but I soon realized that I might want to not lock myself behind just that one game and have to open that game every time I want to use the dialogue builder, and instead build it as a universal tool. So what I've done is create this tool right here, which is hosted without any paywalls on theconceptbay.net. It's a tool where you navigate a bunch of boxes, connect the boxes together, create choices, create dialogue options, execute functions, call sound files, add quests, mark quests as failed or successful, add tasks for those quests, do a whole bunch of common stuff that you would find in the majority of RPG games, and when you're done, this tool spews out a JSON file. All we have to do from that point is program our NPC to open the JSON file, load in the dictionary data for all the dialogues it's supposed to have, and just program it to go through the dialogue conversations. Not only that, this tool was made in such a way where you can take that JSON file and load it back up and just continue working on it and edit whatever you need. I don't know what it is about open world RPG games that appeals to me, but man, I really love them. And I'm really excited to make them. I think RPG mechanics are most friendly with narrative type games, when there's a lot of conversations, a lot of behaviors, a lot of character interactions, a lot of character relationships that need to be sorted out through dialogue. So it may be the fact that I'm a stickler for narrative games is the reason why I'm leaning more towards RPG mechanics for my own games as well. So what I've done in this particular episode is put together some sort of an introductory dialogue between the player and the army sergeant so that it have some sort of a dialogue to work with when I'm working on the actual execution of the dialogue system in Godot engine. You can check out this tool on theconceptbay.net. It's in the tools option in the menu of the website. I got another batch of sounds for the drone vocalizations, so I figured I'm gonna take some time implementing those. Nice. Okay, cool. Cool indeed. As I said, Noah always goes above and beyond with these sounds, so I'm really amazed at the way the game starts to sound. So, oh god, no, he's doing it again. Shoo, get away from here. I'm not gonna lie, all jokes aside, learning how to make a font from beginning to an end, because I do actually implement it into the game, and I do witness how ugly it looks on the alien tablets, does give me experience knowing how much time it's gonna take to create one of these resources. Now, coming back to the subject of the exposition and the intro sequence, before the player actually finds themselves in the spaceship and it's revealed that he's actually a prisoner being delivered back for sentencing, the protagonist of the story starts this narrative with a flashback. It's a flashback to their childhood memory about their relationship with their own father, who in turn was drafted into the Imperial Army to deal with the ongoing conflict the Imperium was involved at the time. This flashback lays down some very important components. You see, this flashback is a tragic moment when the protagonist had lost his father to basically the Imperial Army as far as he was concerned. And of course, in his hysterical state, he never said goodbye to his father, saying a lot of hateful things which he would later, as an adult, regret deeply, and it would be driving his decisions throughout the story. This flashback sets up the motivation of why he decided to try and escape drafting from the Imperial Army. The protagonist, now all grown up, having the family of his own, and having experienced that traumatic moment of losing his father, decided that he would not inflict the same emotional pain onto his own son by trying to evade drafting. Because of his loss, the protagonist grew up with this deeply ingrained hatred for the Imperial Army and everything that it stands for. Not in a way where he becomes the polar opposites and starts fighting against it, but more that he would never let himself become, quote-unquote, an Imperial dog. Little something something I'm borrowing from Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. So in the next few episodes, what I had set out is to create that dream sequence. The styling of the dream sequence is going to be a little bit different. Instead of going for fully colored textures, I'm mostly going to stick to primarily white and gray colors with some edge damage or some edge outlining, almost kind of like a cel-shaded style. I wanted to visually separate the dream sequence from the actual reality. And this kind of a dream sequence is going to come in two places in the narrative. In the introduction, that serves as an exposition that lays down some of the ground rules for the narrative, and in the conclusion, after the player goes through the transformation and performs a certain very significant to the narrative action, which ends up reclaiming his soul, and he goes through the second dream sequence where he, as a spirit, actually gets a chance to visit his own son and perform a proper goodbye, thus saving his son from the same trauma he had to experience himself in his childhood. Throughout the duration of these few episodes, we end up doing a heck of a lot of modeling for the props of this intro sequence, as well as the setup of the base code for the dialogue system that would open up our previously established JSON file and program the dialogue system to go through each and every message, executing the in-between actions like triggering animations, playing music, etc., as the player is clicking through the conversation. So far we've been making do without the actual father model, but I thought it's probably going to be a good idea to place some sort of a silhouette, albeit obscured without any particular level of detail, so that the player actually has someone to talk to and it doesn't look like we're talking to God on the other side of the door. Otherwise, the first impression as soon as you see that door open, it's nothing but just God rays is, God? Yes, Jesus? Tell me the nighttime story again. God damn it, I'm really tired, I just created universe, come on man, cut me some slack over here. So we end up going through the process of setting up another make human model, this time slightly less science fiction-y, so to speak, more or less just a regular human model. Since this is supposed to be a dream sequence, I thought I might actually want to blur out or somehow obscure the facial features of the father, because the particulars of how the father looks aren't really important, and neither did I want the player to really concentrate on that. What I wanted to concentrate is the relationship between the protagonist and the father in those few minutes that we have to work with in the intro sequence. So the goal was to drop all the unnecessary stuff and only concentrate on the relationship. We end up setting up just a few animations that we can trigger between during the conversation, just so that, you know, the father figure isn't threateningly T-posing at us, and just to give him a little bit of extra life. It was nothing spectacular, just a little lean animation here, kind of head turning around, a little bit of idle movement between the motions, just so that he's got a little bit of life to him, it's not just a statue. Because you'd be surprised how easy it is to tell when something isn't actually moving and isn't actually alive in a game. All it took is just a lengthy animation with very light adjustments of the bone rotation or location, just to give them a tiny bit of movement. You can actually see pixels jittering, and that is more than enough to tell this character is a living thing. Now, speaking of the animations, I've actually been for a while considering acquiring a motion capture suit from a company called Rococo in the US. Now, they have a 2-month waiting period for their suits, and they have the full packet, body, hand, and facial capture, which I think is gonna come in quite handy once we are animating the Imperial Army Sergeant. He has some, well, pretty active animations that have to be put together, and I think that hand animating it is going to be a lot of work. We might actually have to be able to capture the human body. Before actually considering the Rococo capture suit, I am looking into some third-party solutions like AI-based video mocap analysis software that can just take a couple of videos from a few angles and convert that to bones. I've previously actually been experimenting with the Microsoft Xbox Kinects, the 360 Kinects. There was a program called Animate that essentially uses one or two or more of these sensors in order to correlate the data between them and create kind of a limited but usable mocap solution that you can actually retarget to your characters, and it will require a little bit of extra work, but if it still saves time than doing hand animations, then it might actually be worth it. The problem is they discontinued it. It's like the one thing that's actually very accessible. You can quite literally go to any Hobomart and chances are you will find a Kinect Sense camera just sitting on the shelf for about $5. And this is kind of where the question comes up. Do I search for alternatives, or do I spend the whatever the $5 that this mocap suit costs and be able to use it throughout my other projects? Because I do have plenty of projects that will have character animations. So in my case, it might be a good investment. I am no stranger to taking out a business loan in order to pick up an expensive piece of hardware. I've done it for my other side gig where I do laser engravements. I had to buy a very expensive fiber laser from Hong Kong, so that process is familiar, and I do have a credit rating with the company that gave me the loan, so I'm sure they'll give me another one to get this mocap suit, and it would be an investment. Sure, I'll have to pay some interest, but you know what? Maybe. I'm kind of on the cusp of it, still considering, yeah, that's the idea at least. What do you think? On one hand, if I get the mocap suit, you'll get to see how to work with mocap data, you'll get to see any mistakes I made, so you'll know not to make them as well. You know, you'll just get to witness how the whole tool works in the context of the project that you have been following so far. On another hand, this means I will be involving certain features, certain tools, hardware that not everybody who's watching this video might have access to. I mean, technically, you do have access to the videos up until this point, and in those videos I am performing animation of the characters by hand, so perhaps for variety's sake that could work, right? This could very well be a factor. So let me know down in the comment section what you think, if you actually made it this far in the video. So, we're actually approaching the finale of this particular video presentation, the journey so far. So, I think at that point, I figured, you know what, we're working on the intro cinematic, so it might be a good opportunity for me to work on some music for that cinematic. Uh-oh. Audio? Hello? Uh-oh. Okay, I think it crapped out. Did it? Yep. Yep. It's fantastic. Okay. So as I was just getting into it, disaster hit. The audio interfaces that I use for audio production, for recording, have crapped out. The reason they crapped out is because they run on an ancient protocol called Firewire. I got these interfaces a whole bunch a while ago, back when Windows 7 was the main operating system, and Firewire was still supported. So the problem with that is Windows 10, which is what I ended up upgrading to, doesn't support Firewire natively. I have to rely on like a third-party driver, and not only that, the Firewire interfaces that I was using, which are Focusrite Sapphire Pro 40s, they are very, very picky eaters when it comes to what kind of a Firewire card you're supposed to have on your machine. I didn't have a motherboard. After I recently upgraded the computer, so it didn't come with a Firewire. It was basically discontinued. So I had to get myself the PCI Express Firewire card in order to connect these. And of course, these sound cards want only the sashimi. They only want creme de la creme of Firewire cards, the most expensive kind, and they still decide to crash on me. Now, they're technically not dead, because the good thing about these interfaces is that I can run them in standalone mode as expander cards for a different kind of interface I would have to now get, but that's basically where my music and sound effect process has kind of stopped. Since then, I have gone to my local music store and I had financed a couple of proper modern USB Type-C user interfaces. I ended up going with a pair of PreSonus Studio 1824 sound interfaces, which should get the job done without interruptions, and so far they have been working out pretty well. But you know, since I financed the interfaces to continue my work on these games, I'm gonna probably have to put off the Mocap suit for a little while until I pay that off. It was time to upgrade anyways. Firewire was just betraying me left and right, every which way. So, for the very last few weeks, what I've been working on is primarily the props for this dream sequence, the kids' room props, the drawers and tables, and simulating cloth physics for some towels on the chair itself, the bed, the sheets. We ended up also modeling a few objects for the second part of the dream sequence, since that flashback actually takes place in 4 separate events. The initial conversation, where the father figure is introduced as a major figure in the life of the protagonist, the conversation between the father figure in a separate flashback when they're playing little army soldiers together, which is very thematic. The cutscene where the father is being drafted into the Imperial Army, the cutscene where the protagonist is basically having like a meltdown, completely hating their father for leaving, a completely irrational behavior from the perspective of an adult, but at the same time is very well a very significant and traumatic experience in a child's life from a child's point of view, from the child's world perspective. And finally, the cutscene where the army representatives arrive to the house and the protagonist opens the door and is informed that his father has perished. Just unceremoniously kind of telling it like that, but we are strapped for time, and we are laying this down as sort of a dystopian future where that is just the way it goes. The army doesn't have time for niceties. They're there to inform the citizens. When they have multiple worlds, multiple planets to deal with, they can't really, be emotional for each and every one of them with their loss, which is the cold, hard reality of what is the Imperium like in this particular future. We set up a few more animations. We set up the living room props, the TV stand, the blinds end up being reused from the kids' room, so some prop usage. And because the player, we did experience a tiny bit of a hiccup in this stage, because for some reason there was this glitch where after I baked the animation for the father figure at the table in the living room, for an unbeknown to me reason, the father was just throwing his arms right as soon as the animation finishes exporting. And that glitch was also translating into Godot engine, so this was clearly something that I had to deal with, otherwise no father animations, and if I run into this problem again, I would just not be able to fix it. So after a little bit of help with the Blender forum, I ended up getting a gentleman to take a look at the files, and he pointed me to the fact that when I was setting up the bone rigs, the constraints that prevent the arms from flying off too far away, basically stretching the ligaments, is actually the culprit of this glitch. Now, unfortunately, by that point, I had actually scrapped and reanimated the character a number of times, thinking that maybe something got messed up in the animations. The armature didn't have correct scaling. It wasn't scaled to 1:1:1 along XYZ axis, because the original armature created by Make Human had to be scaled down in order for the mesh and the model, the father figure, and the second pilot, of course, they had to fit within the scale of the game and Godot engine. Now, I never applied the scale, which is why at that point I thought that was the culprit of the glitch. So yes, I had to reanimate the character needlessly, but you know what? I'll chalk it up to experience. Since the actual culprit of the problem has been revealed, I will now know to make sure that I bake the animations and I apply, or at least disable, the constraints so they don't cause trouble anymore. Whew, all right. Geez, this has turned out to be quite a lengthy one, but you see, this is about maybe half, or I would even say a quarter of a year of progress compressed down into one single video. And I actually didn't want to program anymore until I get these videos out, because good God, is it important to keep these on a weekly basis. I honestly, if I kept it any longer, if this was an entire year's worth of progress, I probably wouldn't even just bother editing. It's just too much. But doing these progress reports is important. I ended up slacking off because the process for editing these was just extremely buggy and crash-ridden, and it was just eating up the entire Saturday just to do an edit for one of these videos. But now I'm going to be seeing about implementing some safety guards into my recording system so that I could still record in the good old MP4 format and have the MKVs in the backup being recorded at the same time, just in case if the computer crashes, the MP4 is going to get corrupted. So, I mean, what am I supposed to delete the coding for that entire hour, 2 hours that just got lost? Instead, we're going to have a backup file that is going to be recalled in case the MP4 gets corrupted, and I can just use that instead. So, I hope you guys enjoyed. And I hope you guys are going to be back for more of these updates. I'm going to try to keep them on every Saturday basis, so you can see how the games are progressing along. There are a couple of more games that I have progress videos, but I haven't made nearly as much progress on those as I have done on this project. So keep an eye out, subscribe, wait for the videos if you want to know where they're going, and I'll see you guys in the next video.